So voting in America, compared to many other countries, is not easy. That's always been true. Election day, for example, is not a holiday like it is in many countries, nor is it even on a weekend, which might make it easier for working class people to vote. So now Donald Trump's relentless effort to undermine the vote in November, let's be clear, he is doing everything possible to suppress the vote. In this case, by crippling the postal service and trying to make it impossible for people's ballots to be counted on time, his efforts are surely corrupt, but he's building on a rickety system that has existed for decades. So let's talk about Donald Trump's attempt to suppress the vote and the broader question about how to get more people into the voting process with a longtime friend and colleague, Miles Rapoport. I got to know Miles many years ago as part of the work he was doing in building a Northeast progressive coalition between labor and other constituencies, and specifically in his role as the Secretary of State for Connecticut. So this is a guy who knows the mechanics of voting down to the nitty-gritty. This is not just some theory for Miles. He's now actually the senior practice fellow in American democracy at Harvard's Ash Center, where he's advocating for a universal civic duty voting. That's right, a requirement that everyone votes. So, Miles, you're probably one of the leading experts on the question of voting in the country, partly because you've done this as an intellectual thinker and someone who's run nonprofit organizations like Demos, for example. Part of Demos's brief was voting and democracy and expanding the rights of people to vote. And you've got all this experience at the granular level as a Secretary of State about how the actual voting mechanics work. So I want to lead off by asking you this question around the fear-mongering that Trump has ignited about voting by mail in the context of the pandemic. And so how much of this is just Trump fear-mongering to suppress the vote? How much of this is actual corruption, where you see post office boxes in the street being removed, people are concerned that the mail sorting devices are disappearing, or how much of this, and I'm not necessarily saying this is not a problem, is simply the chronic underfunding of the election system and the postal system at a time where we're going to have this deluge of mail balloting?
Right, right. Well, Jonathan, thanks for having me. And the truth is, it's both of those things. I think what Trump is doing now is a twofold assault. One is to do all the fear mongering and trying to say that there's a lot of voter fraud, which every single study that has been done over the last 20 years says it's just not, it just doesn't happen. Um, you know, teeny small little pockets of things here and there, but this is a non-issue that Republicans generically over the last 15, 20 years, and Trump, because everything is magnified with him, over the last year has really just, created this nothing burger, as someone would say. Anyway, but I think that so the idea is to just discourage people from wanting to vote, raise questions about whether your vote's going to count, et cetera. And then the second piece that's new is a genuine, serious assault on the U.S. Postal Service, which is essential always and has done always an incredibly good job of dealing with absentee ballots. There's high levels of professionalism. They're really strong unionized workers there, and and have done it. But he installed a postmaster who is doing his bidding, and under the guise of cost cutting, is I think creating a situation in which there will be major delays, and this could be real. Unless it's reversed, which I think is a good possibility, this could really, those two things put together could really put a chill on people making use of mail-in voting at a time when it's a necessity because of the COVID virus.
And the Trump crony who was put in place as Postmaster General, is he doing this and undermining essentially mail-in ballots by not putting enough money into the system, or literally hampering it in its current existence at the level it currently operates? Which is happening more, or is it just both?
No, he's undercutting it in its current form. What we've
Explain
heard.
how. Explain how.
Yeah, he's canceled overtime. So obviously, one of the ways the post office manages to deliver on time is that people work overtime. Many of the post offices have the motto, we don't go home until the last letter leaves the post office. And of course, if you bar overtime, that's not going to happen. And so we know that there are truckfuls of mail that are just being left there because people have to leave at 5 o'clock or they don't get paid. And then he has been removing mailboxes, and also removing some of the mail sorting machinery. All this you can attempt to justify as cost cutting in a department, in a system that's always has some waste in it. But I think this has been weaponized by Trump through his crony in ways that are definitely directed towards undercutting mail-in voting for the election.
So if you were Secretary of State right now of Connecticut, which you served in
Right.
previous life, what would you do? How would you make sure that the mail ballot would proceed flawlessly or as much as possible, given what we expect to be a huge influx of mail ballots because people are concerned about going to the actual polling places? What would you do?
Well, I would do several things. One is, to the degree that it's possible, either as Secretary of the State or through a gubernatorial order or through a special session of the legislature, all of those are possible. Make the time that the absentee ballots or absentee ballot applications are sent out earlier, so that people have more time to do it. I would do a major public education campaign to say to people, don't let it sit on your kitchen table. When you get your application, mail it, because most of the ballots go out 30 to 40 days before the election. So that's plenty of time, even in a post office that's being slowed down. But if you wait and assume that it's not going to work. So I would be trying to extend the deadline and also extend the counting, so that if in fact ballots are coming in late through no fault of the voter, there's more time to count them. Second thing I would do would be to make sure that people utilize early voting. 37 states now have in-person early voting, anywhere from 5 to 25 days in advance. And so you can return your absentee ballot. Instead of putting it in the mail, you can take it to a drop box or return it to your local town clerk or registrar. So there are ways in which I think people can compensate for the idea that the mail is slower.
So let's divide up those a little bit in pieces. Is it in the power of the states on their own to say, we're going to give, I'm just going to make this up, 3 or 5 or 7 days after Election Day for ballots to arrive in order to count them and make them valid? Can the states do that on their own?
Yes, I believe that they can. There are a couple of lawsuits from the Republican Party and the Trump administration to attack that and to try to challenge the lowering of deadlines. So this is going to be the most litigated. And so it's hard to predict exactly how judges in various states are going to decide. But generally speaking, that's a state option, or even in some situations at county options, to change the way the counting is done. Another thing that even local jurisdiction can do is start counting the ballots earlier, or at least do part of the work earlier, so that they can accommodate more absentee ballots.
So there's nothing in the law, that's interesting. There's nothing in the law that says you have to wait till Election Day to open up the ballots. If the ballots start coming in, let's say 5 days ahead of actual Election Day, a Secretary of State, for example, a state legislature could allow the counting to begin before Election Day. So you have it essentially banked.
Yeah, begin the process. Mostly
Yes.
There are laws that say you cannot actually count the ballots. But in terms of processing ballots, most states have an outer envelope and an inner envelope, and you have a security signature match. All that could be done prior to whatever the deadline is. Usually it's noon on Election Day to begin actually counting. So if all that is done, then the counting of the ballots can proceed much more quickly.
Now, there's been a lot of reporting that there's going to be a huge deluge of mail-in ballots that actually starts in September, in the beginning of September. And there's some theory that really the election will be over. And I mean that in practicality of any event changing the outcome of the election. Let's say there's the second or third debate. Joe Biden makes a flub. I'm just, giving an example. It really won't matter because of how many people will have already cast their ballots so early, because people want to do it early. So won't that be a way of basically getting around this fear mongering and what Trump is trying to do to undercut the election if there's a huge early balloting? And isn't that a strategy to encourage people, as you kind of referenced before, to go out and vote as soon as you get your ballot?
Uh, yes, I mean the first reason is to make sure that postal delays don't
Yeah.
make your ballot not count.
Okay.
But it is also true that, I think for campaigns, the more votes you can have, people you can have voting early, whether that's by mail or whether that's by early voting or whether it's by ballot drop off, the better. And it does change the nature of campaigning. It's really
Hmm.
interesting. To the degree that campaigns rely on sending out some miserable, dirty trick material a week before the election, that's not nearly as effective anymore.
Hmm.
And so I think that it requires campaigns to put out their message, put it out early, be clear and consistent about it. I think overall that's a good thing.
Now, I want to shift the conversation because, in a sense, we are talking about, in some way, the small uh, tree in the forest about
Right.
voting. Because the real problem in this country is that most people, or lots of people, just don't vote. We have just a system, putting aside what's happening now, we have a system that frustrates people's ability to vote, even if they want to. And you're at the forefront of trying to do something called universal civic duty voting. So, first of all, explain that in a short version. What is that?
Okay. Let me step back at just a half a second and to say, that I've worked for the last 35 years or so on opening up the process to allow more options for people to register and people to vote. So same day voter registration, pre-registration of 16 and 17-year-olds, early voting, automatic voter registration at motor vehicle departments, all those things. And I believe in those things. I
Mm.
think they have helped. And in 2018, we did have a high turnout relative to most midterm elections, but that high turnout was 50% or 53.4% if you, depending on how you count it. That's a miserable level of turnout for a democracy that wants to govern with the consent of all citizens. And it doesn't have to be that way. So, about 2 years ago, I started working partly with the journalist E.J. Dionne of the Washington Post and of the Brookings Institution. We put together a working group to really look at those countries where voting is a requirement of citizenship. Probably the lead country in this regard is Australia.
Mhm.
In Australia, you have been required to vote as a citizen since 1924. So pretty close to 100 years they have been using this. It's immensely popular. They have 90% turnout at every election. Turnout is not skewed by class and race and age and income and education the way it is in the United States. And you have a much more representative electorate. So our proposal, we released our report called Lift Every Voice, the Urgency of Universal Civic Duty Voting on July 20th. And the argument we make is that the United States should consider voting as a requirement of citizenship, which we already do with serving on a jury or paying taxes or filling out the census. So it's not as if we don't compel people to do things that we think are in the interest of our democracy. I think that we ought to extend that to voting, and I think there would be a tremendous set of benefits to doing that. And so we're hoping after this election, obviously wouldn't affect this election, that starting in 2021, we to generate a serious debate in the country about whether we should take this path.
And I used the analogy when I was thinking about it, as I was reading your quite interesting paper of seatbelts. And here's what we require people to use seatbelts. People mostly comply with that because they consider driving essential in most places. And so the analogy would be, and it's a maybe not a perfect analogy, that voting is essential in this country, and that requirement should be, again, everybody should be required to vote because that is part of how you have a healthy society. And so all along that kind of continuum of things that we require people to do, it's a no-brainer to have voting included in that.
Right. I mean, for me, the even clearer analogy is with jury service
Yeah.
because the reasoning is the same. We ask everybody to serve on a jury because we want people to be judged by a jury of their peers, not a jury of their old peers or a jury of their white peers, but by a jury of everyone. And so that's a requirement of citizenship. Same thing with voting, I think, which is that we want the decisions that are made by the country to be made by everyone, rich and poor, black, white, Latinx, everyone. And I think that mandating that you have to participate in a vote, you don't have to vote, by the way, our recommendation is not you have to vote for a particular candidate or even any candidate. You can leave it blank. You just have to participate in the election. And we think that this would be a very healthy development.
And I'm glad that you used Australia as an example. As I mentioned to you before we got on the air here in our emails, I lived in Australia for a couple of years and I took part in the electoral system, not as a voter because I wasn't a citizen, but I actually worked on a campaign there for the Labor Party. And I also, believe it or not, they let me count ballots. And to your point, a lot of people at the last moment came speeding in with their cars, parked their cars, ran in, signed in, went into the ballot box and cast a blank ballot or cast a ballot for Mickey Mouse, or there were some other bizarre ones, or some of the ballots included some expletives. But the point is they showed up at the ballot place, and actually those folks who cast weird ballots were in the distinct minority. Let's be clear. And hanging over that was a modest fine. I believe it was $50 that if you didn't vote, you were fined $50. And it was kind of a very light touch to that. And actually, I don't think that that was a huge deal to people because it became part of the culture of the country that voting is a requirement.
Right, exactly. Actually, the fine is even lower than that. It's about 15 US dollars for your first offense. And not very few people pay it. About 13% of non-voters actually pay the fine. And our recommendation is that it could be substituted by community service or a warning system, a lot of different ways. I think I like the word you use, light touch enforcement. But I do think that it would get into the culture that this is something that everyone does, which is to vote. And by the way, campaigns would no longer have to spend millions and millions of dollars trying to do turnout because they would know everybody was voting, and they would have to tailor their message to the entire electorate because everybody's listening all the time and they're all going to vote. So just sort of firing up your base and discouraging the other candidate's base doesn't work in that system. So I think it would be better in lots and lots of ways. So we're going to try to make this into a national conversation. And thanks for the opportunity to let me talk about it.
Well, I'm happy to. And sort of as a wrap up question, then, it's kind of the question of the cart before the horse, which is a lot of the reason that people don't vote is because they think it doesn't matter, meaning that politics don't matter. Whoever gets into office is still going to screw them one way or the other. They're not going to be treated fairly. They're not going to look out for them. And I'm thinking actually of people who I would consider to be potentially progressive voters. Now, I understand there's huge barriers for people to actually be able to cast their vote. So which would come first? Do you think at the same time there has to be a sense on the part of the electorate that, hey, this is worth doing, or are they still just going to take the $20 fine because they still don't see the reason to vote?
I've always felt like saying this is the one reason people don't vote or that is the one reason people don't vote. It's always a mistake. There are definitely some people who don't want to vote because they don't feel like it or they don't feel represented. But there are other people for whom they haven't heard about it. Nobody's knocked on their door because they're not registered. So I do believe that if procedurally we both make it easy for people to register and vote, and then subsequently also require them to vote, you've done a half of the horse or a half of the cart, whatever. And then, of course, it is the responsibility of parties and candidates to give people a reason to vote and to have policies that are responsive to people's needs. If we do both of these things, we encourage people to vote, we make it easy for people to vote, and we give them a reason to vote, I think people will respond in a positive way.
Well, thank you for all the advocacy you've done on behalf of the people all these years, on behalf of voting, on behalf of democracy. And we want to follow this here on the show. So you'll come back and tell us how it's going as it develops and as it unfolds in the country. Thanks for being on the show, Miles.
Glad to be here. Thanks, Jonathan. Good luck.